Well, good evening, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. This is the second time that I come and present my work for the Hellenic and the Roman societies. And today I'm going to be talking about Paestum as a city of temples. We'll talk about architecture, cult, and society in a sanctuary that we've been excavating for the past 2 years and that we are continuing to excavate at the moment. And I'm starting with a quotation. At last, when we were doubting whether we were passing through rocks or ruins, some great oblong masses enabled us to distinguish the remains of temples and other monuments of a once splendid city. The first sight of them excited nothing but astonishment. These crowded masses of stumpy conical pillars appear heavy, not to say frightful. But I soon recollected myself, called to mind the history of art, thought of the times when the spirit of the age was in unison with the style of architecture, and realized the severe style of sculpture. And in less than an hour found myself reconciled to it. Nay, I went so far as to thank my genius for permitting me to see with my own eyes such well-preserved remains, since drawings give us no true idea of them. It is only by going round them and passing through them that you can impart to them their real character. You evoke for them, not to say infuse into them, the very feeling which the architect had in contemplation, end quote. So this is what Goethe wrote in one of his letters when he first visited Paestum in 1787. And I think these words capture the nature of the site and the power that Paestum's sacred buildings still hold to this day. The three Doric temples that you can see here, the one up there in the north, the Temple of Athena, so dedicated to Athena and Hera. And then the Temple of Argive Hera on the River Sele, with its impressive sculpted metapiece. And then the Temple of Mens Bona in the Roman Forum, and the sanctuary dedicated to Aphrodite, Venus, just south of the city walls, and many others. So temples do trace the cultural, social, and architectural history of Paestum from the Greek colony to the Lucanian center and the Roman city. And today I will discuss the preliminary results of an archaeological campaign conducted by the archaeological parks of Paestum and Velia that has brought to light a new sanctuary by the western city walls. So the first season began in September 2022. It ended in March 2024. And just in a couple of weeks, we're going to start a new excavation. So in Paestum, we're in Campania, we're on the Tyrrhenian coast. And this is a plan of the city. You can see in purple, that's the archaeological area that you can visit today as part of the park and the museum. What you see in orange are the ancient fortifications, and then there with that red dot, you can see the location of the sanctuary. Now, before we actually get to the beginning of the excavations in September 2022, we have to take a step back and we have to go to the 12th of June 2019. So as part of a completely different project, of a nationally funded project, which was about the requalification, conservation, and fruition of the city walls from Porta Area to Tower 18 and of some of the insula. So as part of this project, what happened is that it was necessary to clear the vegetation that was all along the city walls and actually on the city walls as well. You can see that was the condition of the city walls back then. And while clearing the area, architectural fragments started to appear. They were right on the surface. They were brought back up to the surface essentially by plowing and in general about agricultural works. So you can see there were bits of capitals and then columns and metopies, triglyphs, geisa, a bit of everything. But we're not talking about tens of architectural fragments. We're talking about hundreds, about 250 architectural fragments, and they were scattered along the city walls for about 150 meters. And there was in particular a very high concentration within a stretch of 50 meters. So the first thing that was done, we worked with aerial photography and then carried out geophysic and georadar prospections. And thanks to this analysis, what happened is that the presence of a building, and clearly of a sacred building, of a temple, appeared there. And that bit to the right, about 10 meters from the temple, then turned out to be the altar. So excavation started in March 2020. Now, if you remember what happened in March 2020, you realize that timing was not ideal. The excavations lasted 6 days, 6 full days before the trench had to be closed. So then we go to September 2022. So this is basically on, I think, the 6th of March, the condition of the trench. So you can see the temple that starts appearing. Then we got September 2022. We reopened the trench and we expanded it, actually. We expanded it north, south, and east. We couldn't, of course, expand it west because you can see that the temple is located precisely by the city walls. And they are operating the drone. You see an archaeologist, Dr. Francesco Mele, who has been in the field every single day from September 22 to March 2024, and he'll be back there in a couple of weeks. Okay, so let's start looking at the history of this sanctuary, starting, of course, from the end of its life. So one thing that is very important to realize is that today, of course, the coastline is about 800 meters from the city walls. But in antiquity, that was not the case. The landscape was very different. So what you have to imagine is that right on, just a few meters past the city walls, you had a cliff. And you had a cliff like about 8-10 meters, and it dropped. Then you had immediately the lagoon, then a couple hundred meters, and then you had the sea, okay? So you have to start placing this sanctuary in its landscape. So, as I said, let's start from the end. We have the collapse of this part of this portion of the city walls, of the inner facing of the city walls, and that is something that probably happened in late antiquity. It must have happened at a point in time when it didn't make sense to repair them, because the city walls of Paestum are repaired pretty much everywhere, and the fact that this particular collapse was not repaired is quite significant. And then what happened when we removed the blocks of the fortifications, we found instead the collapse of the western facade of the temple. And the two collapses did not happen at the same time, because there's actually a layer in between. So at some point, the temple must have collapsed, and then later on, the city walls fell on it. Okay, and in this respect, as I said, it must have happened, the collapse of the temple must have happened at a point in time when the sanctuary was no longer in use, and the collapse of the city walls, as I said, probably in late antiquity. This is the collapse of the evidence that we have of the collapse of the western facade of the temple. That is very interesting because the later collapse of the walls actually protected this first collapse, and so we find everything in situ. The context is not disturbed at all, and we have even here a bit of everything: triglyph, triglyphs, metopies, geyser, a fragment of the architrave, a fragment of a capital, Reichengassen, and then some fragments of the pediment. But okay, so we talked about a phase, the sort of the last phase of the sanctuary's life. Actually, it's post-mortem phase. But what we do know, what we immediately found out when we started exploring this area. So first of all, we identified the altar about 10 meters from the eastern facade of the temple. And then we immediately uncovered in this area this rectangular area between the temple and the altar, which is about 60 square meters. And what we found there was essentially a carpet of votive objects. This is a votive objects that have been carefully arranged in this area. And those objects speak about a sanctuary that was certainly in use when Paestum was a Latin colony and Roman city. So after 273 BC. So we had to actually, there was the amount of the material was such that we had to grid the area, and then we collected several layers of finds. I mean, just to give you a sense of the amount of material that was recovered here, I think we got to 330 crates of finds so far. So needless to say, we're still going through them, but it's a huge amount of material. So what is going on with this space? So altar here, this is a very interesting stone in front of the altar. It was an inclined stone, and it had this kind of concave part in the center, and it was probably used to collect, the liquids from sacrifices, to collect them to the ground. So this area, we gather the material, and it was probably, as I said, the arrangement of all these votive objects probably right before the sanctuary was abandoned. So when was it abandoned? Well, we don't have evidence here that is later than the 1st century AD. So this sanctuary was in use until the end of the Republican period, very beginning of the imperial period, and then nothing. And there's also evidence of certain rituals of closure, of abandonment of the site. And probably the arrangement of these objects is part of these rituals. So here you can see the grid that we used. And this is just a selection of the objects that were found. I mean, we have plenty of ceramics, but in particular, we have thousands and thousands of terracotta figurines. And they represent deities, worshippers, animals, everything. And also, I must say, unfortunately, they don't point to one specific god or goddess. At some point, I was really hoping that this could be, finally the temple of Poseidon, by the sea. I was like, maybe this is it. But unfortunately, that is not the case. But we've got even, we've got statuettes of Athena, we've got Apollo, we've got Dionysus, we've got Aphrodite. So a bit of everything. This is our find specialist, Dr. Manuela Ferraioli, who's been and still is to this day incredibly busy going through all this material. Because at the same time, we also then had to carry out a conservation project. So this is just to give you a sense of the types of figurines that have been found in that area. So Aphrodite or Lithia, but still a goddess linked to fertility. We've got Hera. Then we've got the very famous flower women, the Donne Fiore, typical of Paestum. Lions. We've got several representations of Eros riding a dolphin. Then we found quite a few, actually, 7 bullheads, terracotta bullheads, and in particular, these were found all around the altar. And then several miniature models of temples, altars. So see, these are 2 terracotta temples, 2 miniature marble altars. So while I said that the evidence does not, or at least this later evidence does not point to a specific deity, we can identify a sphere that seems to be most prominent, and that refers to fertility and Eros. There are several representations, as I said, of Aphrodite, but also several representations of Eros. We've got hermaphrodites. We even have a figurine of a baby in swaddling clothes. Okay, so this sanctuary definitely lived, as I said, until the late imperial period, but the temple is not Roman. The temple is clearly, and we'll see why. I mean, based on the architecture, so based on stylistic considerations, then supported also by the pottery. The temple itself can be dated to the very beginning of the 5th century BC. And the size is 11.60 by 7.60. It's got a 4x6 colonnade, and the cella, which is very well preserved, is 6.90 by 3.70. To give you a sense of the size of this building compared to the major temples that we have in the urban area, the Temple of Neptune is about 25 meters of width and 60 meters of length, okay? So you've got a third, a fourth of the size. So it's a small temple. This is a reconstruction. These are some sketches that have been drawn by Dr. Mele, sort of reconstruction of what the temple would have looked like between the early 5th century BC all the way down to the 1st century AD. So I said that this is an example of a late archaic Doric temple, and that the dating is supported by stylistic considerations. So we have, as I said, hundreds of architectural fragments, stone fragments, and then we'll also look at the terracotta, the architectural terracottas from the roof. These are some of the fragments that were found on the surface. You can see here we've got Doric capitals, we've got some drums here, column drums. We have a sandstone metope decorated with this rosette motif. And then we could be more specific about the architectural features of the building by looking at the material that came from this undisturbed context on the western facade. So as I mentioned earlier, here we found triglyphs. You can see that they were found exactly where they were supposed to be. So this is a primary context. This is a primary collapse. We were very lucky. We even had the angular triglyph. Then metopes, some geyser, a bit of the angular part of the architrave, one just small fragment of a Doric capital, some fragments of raking geison, and then the pediment fragments. We carefully removed all these architectural fragments, actually most of them. We had to leave some in place because otherwise the rest of the walls would risk collapsing, so for safety reasons. So as I mentioned earlier, pediment. These are the pediment fragments that were recovered, and you see that they still show traces of the plaster as well as the painted decoration. The geyser, these are quite important for the dating of the temple at the beginning of the 5th century, because what they show is the elaboration of a proper, mature Doric style. This is the angular triglyph with the architrave, and you can see that this triglyph is in travertine, but we also had sandstone triglyphs. And the same thing was true about the metopes. We had some travertine metopes, and then also had those sandstone metopes that I showed you earlier. So the combination of different materials in the architecture of the same temple suggested to us that actually the sandstone elements might be reused from an earlier building. That's also because the size, it's not just about the material, but the size of the sandstone metopes is different from the size of the travertine metopes, so of quite a few centimeters. So we thought that the sandstone parts could have been, as I said, reused from an earlier building. And that is suggested also by the fact that, let me see if I have it, no, I don't have it here, that part of a rosette that decorated one of those sandstone metopes was found cut, intentionally cut, and it was dedicated in that area, in that rectangular area that I mentioned earlier. So it was almost placed there as a votive object. Now, the idea of the existence of an earlier building, so that what we are facing here is not just a late archaic sanctuary that then lived across the Lucanian and Roman period, but that there was an earlier building, was then confirmed when we started excavating inside the temple. Now, we were in a way unlucky that in the 20th century, essentially agricultural works damaged significantly the stylobate of the temple. You can see some marks here, some plow marks on the structure. And so most of the stylobate, not all of it, but most of the stylobate, unfortunately, is gone. But that also gave us the opportunity to dig inside the temple. So this is a peripteral Doric temple. So we were able to dig inside and also inside the cella. So what we found doing that was not just ceramic evidence that supported the dating of the temple at the beginning of the 5th century BC, but we also found that in the foundations of this temple, we have many fragments, many architectural fragments that were reused from an earlier building. We've got fragments of the stylobate, of the pediment, and most importantly, we have capitals, Doric capitals. To be more specific, we have 16 fragments, 16 halves of Doric capitals. They were carefully cut in half and to be reused more easily. And by looking at those capitals, I have to say I asked for the help of the best, essentially, the leading authority in the field. I asked Professor Dieter Mertens, the leading authority in Doric architecture, especially in Magna Grecia, to kind of help us with the dating of these capitals. And he didn't have any doubt. Comparing these capitals with the ones of, there we have them. So you can see how they've been cut. You can see that there's even plaster and paint still preserved on some of them. But the shape of the capital suggests a dating in the first half of the 6th century. They're even earlier than the capitals of the so-called basilica, so one of the 3 major temples. And the basilica is dated to 560, 540. So these could be even earlier than that. So what we would then have here is a building that would date to the first half of the 6th century, and that would then be replaced by that later early 5th century temple. The size of the capitals compared to the capitals of the later building suggests that the size of this first temple would be roughly the same as the second one. So we're still talking about a relatively small Doric temple. Here we also had to carry out some conservation work, of course, in situ, and then we will perform also XRF and Raman spectroscopy analysis on the paint. Okay, so first building. If we're really dealing with a building from the around 585, 70 BC, that means a temple that was built a couple of decades after the foundation of the colony of Poseidonia, because Poseidonia was founded roughly between the end of the 7th, the very beginning of the 6th century BC. So let's see what the roofs, what the evidence from the roofs can tell us. So what we found in terms of terracotta revetments actually confirmed the existence of these 2 building phases. So this is just a selection of the of the fragments of Sima, of Geisa, of the dripstones that were found. Let's start from the ones from the bits that refer to the late archaic building, so to the second temple, as it were. As you can see, lots of fragments were found very close to the temple. They were actually, this is not a primary context. They were then pushed, so they must have fallen from the roof, and then they were pushed, probably for a ritual reason as well. They were pushed very close to the sides of the temple. So they were found north of the temple, south of the temple, and also in front of its main facade. Here, this is the entrance on the east side, and you can see parts of the Sima scattered together with all those votive objects that I mentioned earlier. Okay, let's look at them. These are some of them have been reconstructed, and even when we were still in the field. So just by looking at the image to the left here and the one to the right, what you realize is that we're dealing with two series of Simae. So they look very similar, but they're not. If you pay attention, for example, the iconography of the lion's head is similar, but there are details about the eyes or about the jaw that are different. And when you look at the palmette, the motif of the palmette, you can see that the one to the right is a little bit wider and a little bit sort of shorter, and the one to the left instead is narrower. Okay, so why is that? Well, there's probably a first series of Simae that were used for the building. So when the temple was built in the early 5th century, this is what they used for the roof. And they're characterized by not just by this particular stylistic features, but what you realize is that the paint is usually very well preserved on these examples. Whereas when you look, and yeah, these are, you can see that how well preserved the paint is, even on the dripstones. This is the lion. Whereas when you look at the other series, you realize that it's not just the iconography, but there are also some technical differences. In particular, paint is pretty much never preserved, and instead what we have is a thick layer of plaster. So what happened is that probably these were just repairs that were done to the roof at some point, because as I mentioned, built in the early 5th century BC, then used throughout the 4th, 3rd, 2nd, 1st century BC. So at some point, they must have needed some repairs. And we were also able to find architectural terracottas that refer to the earlier buildings, so to the 6th century temple. We have just a few pieces here, but they're very meaningful, very important. I'll show you a couple of examples in more detail. So this is a fragment of a lateral Sima, and what you can see inside is a Greek letter that is incised there. That's a mason mark. And this Simae can be compared to other fragments of Simae that come from the northern sanctuary of Paestum, so the area where the big temple of Athena is now built, and where in the 6th century BC, in the early 6th century BC, there was a small temple dedicated again to Athena that was then replaced by the big one at the end of the 6th century, at the end of the Archaic period. So that Sima, then the dripstone. You can see we no longer have a dripstone with a lion's head, but there is a completely different type of dripstone that can be dated, in fact, to the first half of the 6th century. They are tubular dripstones, and again, they find parallels in this roof that again come from that temple, from that archaic temple in the northern sanctuary. Same thing about this fragment that refer to the pseudo-antefix. So they all come from, as I said, from early 6th century roofs. And then finally, there are these 3 fragments that refer to an antefix that you can see represent, we have a gorgon. And that again can be placed chronologically in the 6th century BC. Then we kept going. You would think, you know, we're done. Well, actually, digging even further, what we found underneath the foundation of the temple was this structure. You see these travertine stones that at the beginning they seem kind of randomly placed there, but at the end they actually draw a structure. It's almost like a sacred enclosure, an original sacred enclosure that might have been present there even before the first stone temple was built. And the fact that this area, that the sort of sacred area was created even before the 6th century temple is also suggested by the fact that west of the temples, so between the temples and then the city walls, we found another structure that is earlier. You can see that it's parallel to the temple, but the pottery places it, and actually, I mean, the stratigraphy, most of all, places it in an earlier phase. So what's going on here? The life of this sanctuary begins shortly after the foundation of Poseidonia, at the beginning of the 6th century BC. So a sacred area was created on the western edge of the city, on a cliff overlooking the lagoon, just a couple 100 meters from the sea where the colonists had arrived. A first Doric temple was built around 580, 570 BC, and then replaced with a new Doric building at the turn of the century, in the context of a major process of urban monumentalization. That is the time when the Temple of Athena and the Temple of Neptune were built, and when the Temple of Hera on the river Sele also underwent rebuilding. Votive objects indicate a female cult closely linked to the sphere of Eros and fertility. There is no solution of continuity in the use of the sanctuary across the Lucanian and Roman periods until the 1st century AD, when the area was abandoned, probably defunctionalized by the construction of the fortifications. So once fallen into disuse, the temple collapsed, and a portion of the fortifications later fell on it, probably in late antiquity. So the life of this sanctuary follows the development of the city of Paestum across almost a millennium, and is shedding new light on our understanding of landscape, urban, cultural, and social transformations from the origins of the Greek colony through late antiquity. Thank you. And this is our team that I would like to thank. They've been absolutely wonderful, and they continue to work extremely hard. Thank you.